Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and we're making some progress on our GBS project, Project Zero. I think the last thing you saw was we put the rear suspension together, and now what I'm trying to do is to get the engine and transmission, or rather I should say the engine block and the transmission in the car. And I'm going to show you some of the holdups with my chassis and the drivetrain that I'm using in particular. Again, the engine block is still bare. I've put the engine mounts on it so that I can throw it into the chassis. I think I've mentioned it before, but the engine and transmission I'm using are from a third generation NC Miata or MX-5. This engine in particular is a 2-liter engine versus the 2.5. And the transmission I'm using is this 5-speed. Now, if you look all the way up here, you have the mount makes this kind of Z transition. And this is where it picks up on the chassis side, is this kind of fork shape here. And then the mount is a bushing that sits in this area. And this Z shape sits really tight in the chassis. Now, if we look at the chassis, this bar, which comes across the chassis, is in the way. And I need to chop this piece out so it comes forward, it's flush with this transmission mount, and then back out, and then take it a nice cut here and a nice cut here. I'm not really worried about this weakening the chassis down here at all because it's superfluous. This transmission mount does the same duty that this tube does. And in later cars, in the Gen 2 chassis, this tube is actually cut here and here and capped off. So I know it's not necessary. You can see that I've already done some chassis mods here to clearance the tubes. I still got to clean that up and knock these back down a little bit to make sure that they clear. But again, this is a problem I found with the Gen 1 chassis and the drivetrain in particular I'm using. These tubes in the later cars, in the Gen 2s, are forward a little bit more so that you don't have these interference problems, and you can clearance, they clear the transmission when you're trying to put it in. Where it interferes on the transmission is actually here and over here, and these are the detents that keep the shifter in neutral. So I can't cut these or grind them down. I can't clearance these at all. What I have to do is just modify the chassis side. If you order one of these Zeros today, you'll get a Gen 2 chassis. So these are not modifications that you will need to make. In fact, if you use this exact same drivetrain in a Gen 2 chassis, it's fire and forget. You will not have any of these kind of fitment issues that I'm running into. This is solely because the drivetrain I'm working with, I wanted to have the later generation Miata drivetrain, but put it in the Gen 1 chassis. And some of that's just down to the choice that I made to snap up a kit that was already built. It was a Gen 1. I didn't spec the build initially, like I didn't spec the color. That was all done beforehand. I just snapped one up that was sitting at the factory for a long time. So these are just kind of the results of those choices, and I don't mind at all. Anthony at the factory has been instrumental in providing CAD documentation with FEA to show me that these tubes aren't load-bearing, that I can clearance them and cut into them without any kind of issue or detriment to the rigidity of the chassis. And I can't thank Anthony enough. So everyone at GBS has been really, really supportive. So if you're thinking about one of these kits, I cannot recommend them enough. What I want to do is start clearancing that pan, cut that tube out, and then see if we can't get the transmission and engine block in the car today. Fingers crossed. All right, so done cutting. This is our after, so you can see that we've ground away the tubes, cut out that bit. We'll pretty this up later and cap these tubes off so we don't get water intrusion, and that'll do a lot of good for rust prevention. I'm even put squirt some rust prevention in the tubes before I cap them off. Ditto for these guys up here. But our next step is we can try and get the transmission mounted in the car now that that's out of the way. So let's go ahead and do that. There's something missing over there. There's something missing over there because it's all in here. So it's difficult to see down there, but right down in there, that's where that transmission mount pickup is. And just in front of that is where we were clearancing. You can see just how tight the transmission gets here in the tunnel. It doesn't, it doesn't move, but it's really, really tight clearancing. On the other side, you can see we had plenty of space, but it's just over here on the driver's side where things get really tight. But you can see underneath where that mount sticks down, you have these two mount bolts. This is that Z-shaped mount here. And this is why we had to cut that out, is because you physically could not get this in here because it needed to choke right up on this transmission mount. You can see, looking up forward, just kind of how far down that bell housing sticks. The engine pan should be just about that low. The car right now is probably a couple inches higher than ride height, so I am a little bit worried about how far down that bell housing is. Looking at the top side, you can see just how tight things are going to get exhaust wise, because the stock location for these are like not really fuel rails, but this is your feed and return to your pump, etc. And they're nylon, and it is kind of close to the exhaust, so I'm going to reroute these probably lower in the pan, actually onto this side, onto the cold side of the motor. The exhaust level, actually, I'll just sort of rest that there, but you can see that this is way too long, and what I need to do is this collector and these tubes need to sit just a few inches off the body, not a foot. So these pipes need to be trimmed to length, and then once that's done, everything can be final welded up. All right, so basically they need to be cut somewhere down in this area. This is a really big moment because I was waiting to get the engine and transmission and the head in the car, but unbuilt like it sits currently, so that I could measure and cut our exhaust manifold so that it could be sized correctly for the car, and then that's going to get sent off to be black ceramic coated. The engine, now that I have it in here, I can look at my tolerances for like the starter, which will usually fit right in here. It kind of hugs close, I'm not too worried about it. But I also wanted to make sure that the engine harness, which is here, would actually be okay down here on the lower rail. But I think it might be a little tight, we'll see. But the idea was to not have it attached to this bar and to run it on a lower rail to keep it further out of sight. And this is just like the basic chassis harness. The engine harness is separate. I did want to put my sump tank and my lift pump here against the firewall. I think that'll be a decent location. And again, I'll be able to hide some stuff down here. But otherwise, that is a major, major step towards making some progress on the car. All this is going to have to come out again, but The big thing we need to do is trim the exhaust and get it sent out, and then all of this stuff can come out and we can start building the engine, modify the transmission with our throwout bearing parts, and rebuild the head. So awesome. All right, one more quick job here, and we're gonna try to put our steering rack in. Not sure if you can see that, but get our wiring harness out of the way. All right, now we need our clamps. Pretty simple stuff. You just put the steering rack on this brace, this mount, and you're gonna slide the U-bolt on one side, and then there's this clamp on the other, and then we just need to tighten those up. You want to try and torque these down evenly. You also don't want to torque it so tight that it begins to deform the rack in any way. And then on the other side, we just have our U-bolt. All right, once we got those bolts tightened up, we have our kind of U-bolt here. We have our clamp on this side. We got our tie rods connected on each side. So take a step back, and we have an aggressive tow out situation, but our front suspension is finished. That looks really sharp. Again, I can't say enough about these ATR uprights and these huge brakes. Completely overkill for this car, but they just look like $1 million. So I think that's gonna do it for today. That was we actually got quite a bit done there with clearancing the chassis, getting the trans and the engine in, and getting that steering rack put in. I'm actually really excited. I'm not showing much, but I'm really excited to be at this point because there's no more real roadblocks. It's full steam ahead with getting that exhaust cut to length, getting that out for coating, and then getting the engine built. So look forward to all that in coming videos. But for now, that's going to do it, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.